Okay, so the Joint Finance Committee meeting of July 31st will come to order. The first order of business is to call the roll for the City Council.
Councilmember Avani?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Bass?
Yes.
Councilmember Elston?
Here.
Quorum is present.
Mr. Miller, if you call the roll for the school board, please.
Mr. Demaria?
Here.
Mr. Albright?
Here.
Liz? Mrs. Kiefer? Here.
We have a mutual quorum at 6 and all present, sir.
All right, sounds good. Well, here we are again. I think this is the 6th meeting of this joint committee. And we've got a pretty full agenda this evening. I'd like to thank everybody for being here this evening. The first order is the approval of the minutes from the July 11th meeting, which I think you all have seen. We need a motion. And do we have a second? All those in favor? Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Abstain.
Okay. The first item under discussion topics is a report on the Jenny Dean Elementary School study. I will turn that over to my co-chair. Sir?
Mr. Avani, thank you. I'll do some real quick level setting of why we're here. There's a thick document that's been handed out. As council knows, the school board, based upon actions taken by this committee 2 meetings ago, passed 4-2. That it is in the best interest of the city, based upon what the funding authority, the people said, that we should be delaying Dean relative to the ability of the city to pay for it, initiating a study for what is the impact of that. It's the impact associated with the current school that has not had capital improvements made to extend its life expectancy 5 years. The cost associated with trailers, because one of the needs we have is capacity. It is not just an aging facility with infrastructure issues, it's capacity. That's going to be presented tonight. With us is Bill Downing. He's the president of Downing & Scott. He has been in the school construction and the community construction business almost 40 years. He has worked with many schools throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia and has an extensive amount of knowledge. If we were in a court, I think we would all agree he is an expert witness. So, Andy, Bill, do you all want to start the presentation? Are we going to be doing it?
Sure. I'll just stand if that's okay. Thank you for the introduction. I also serve as an expert witness occasionally, and I can tell you I really like building things better than I like going through construction litigation. We were fortunate enough to be chosen, my firm, as the clerk of works for the construction of the new Baldwin Elementary and Intermediate School. So we had a pleasure of working with your staff. And I got to tell you, City of Manassas, we work with school divisions and municipal governments around the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the City of Manassas has got some top-notch staff members here, and it's something to be proud of. So what we did, we have assembled an assessment document for the existing Jenny Dean School and prepared a capital improvement budget that corresponds by calendar year in a master summary document. It's a large fold-out document that's in your bound book. And we took a look at all of the major systems. We took a look at the code compliance issues with the Americans with Disabilities Act, current building codes and regulations, and we also looked at the life cycle of the equipment that was in the building, some of which is relatively new and in pretty good shape, such as the food service equipment. So we had a team of 5 people, including myself, which would be 6, going through every space, roof inspections, interior inspections, restroom inspections, and came up with a list of issues that needed to be addressed, and based upon our judgment, Those capital improvements we placed in calendar years. And some of those calendar years run through, in your case, our mission was to take it through 2028. Well, we found that all of the necessary improvements to Ginny Dean to extend the life of that facility actually would, the expenses would be occurred ending around 2026. And one major caveat with that is it right after the 2030 threshold, we found that the roof systems that are on that facility, if it goes beyond 2030, you would need to be budgeting additional monies for roof replacements around that facility.
And Bill, this isn't like a shingled roof. I mean, it's a 7-figure number for a new roof?
The roof, a rough order of magnitude estimate is about $1.3 million to replace the roof systems throughout that. Multiple additions added over time, as well as the original core facility. Next slide. I also wanted to talk a little bit. I understand the city is staring at numerous projects in both the schools and the city government. I wanted to talk a little bit about what's happening in the construction market right now and some of the trends that are unfolding. It's not good news, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it is actual fact that we're in a very active construction market right now with an incredibly limited labor pool of skilled subcontractors as well as the mechanics that do the work. It ranges from masons, carpenters, to HVAC mechanics, to electricians, and there's just not a lot of young people entering the construction trades in our current situation. There's a wage war going on, which is driving costs up to keep skilled people in the subcontractor community. Margins have gone up with companies that are bidding work. We've seen over the past year significant increases in material costs. Actually, it started after the 3 hurricanes a couple of years ago, back to back, and has continued and continues to today in the steel and metals market. And the metals market includes copper, aluminum, magnesium, metals that the construction industry is heavily dependent upon. And it continues today to keep increasing. Some of the reasons for that are attributable to the tariffs and policies that have been enacted and the ongoing trade war. So in what I'm showing you here is based upon the Virginia Department of Education. It takes and tracks data going back. We've gone back 40 years to track data in some cases to see how these trends evolve. And you can take a direct correlation to the calendar year in terms of economic activity and the economy in general to see how these high inflationary cycles correlate to economic activity. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. We would be remiss and not serving you well if we didn't advise you to anticipate additional escalation costs on these projects. So what we've done for the costs contained in this assessment, as well as the other cost models that I'm getting ready to show you, is we've anticipated a reasonable annual rate of escalation of these costs. We have not anticipated the trends that you would see starting in 2003, 4, 5, and 6. Those were truly anomalies. And that trend was directly attributable to China buying up the U.S. domestic recycled steel market 100%. So we know what caused that. What we're very concerned with in out years is what the results of the current tariffs on metals, including copper, including aluminum, including steel, will do to the metals market, that take it perhaps even further. So we've made recommendations for your capital program in terms of future out year looks, but again, nobody knows what will happen. Next slide. So just some key points to think about is that I get asked this question quite often is, how come your escalation forecasts and the evidence that the state is unturned is not consistent with the consumer price index? And the answer is very simple, is that the CPI is just not a very good indicator of what's happening in the construction market. The construction market will always outpace it, both directions, in inflationary periods as well as deflationary periods. So we measure the market activity in multiple ways. We study the Federal Reserve reports monthly. Those are good sources of information. Federal spending and stimulus. If there's a huge infrastructure act that gets passed by Congress by some miracle, that could also affect your future in terms of your CIP and budgeting. But what we want to just suggest is that to monitor that, there are sources for you to regularly check. The Virginia Department of Education is up around April and May. They will publish the data from the prior year, so it's a rear look in the rear view mirror. It's not always an accurate picture of where the market will go. But what we have found is that these trends do repeat themselves, and in the construction market, these trends will happen again, both deflationary and inflationary. So I'm here just to talk through not only what we did with Ginny Dean, but I also wanted to talk through with two other tests that we performed for the school division. Next slide. This bound edition that you were given tonight is what I'm calling option one, which would take the existing Ginny Dean and extend it as far as a life cycle of major components to take it through the year 2028. And if you notice on the slide, as a cautionary note, the roof replacements that we anticipate, if that facility stays in operation, would be falling in the year 2030 and would range in cost from about $1.1 to $1.3 million. Second option that we looked at is to take the existing Ginny Dean and increase the capacity to 1,000 to 1,050 students and change the educational program, which is now a pre-K, Head Start through 4th grade, to change that program to a 4 through 6 program. And we did an estimate of probable cost on that and put it in 2021 dollars. We arrived at a price tag of just under $56 million. One of the big contributors to that is that the existing site at Ginny Dean, there are areas that are compliant on the site with current stormwater regulations, but there's other larger areas that are not compliant under the current stormwater management regs. And those costs will be significant. When you expand the program and going through the permitting and the jurisdictional approval process, we believe that it's going to be fairly extensive cost to bring that remaining site up to current standards with the best management practice in the current regs, which is attributable to a fairly large chunk of site development costs that are in this estimate. And we have, as handouts, copies of this if you all have not seen that.
They all have.
They have, okay.
I just gave just us.
So the third task that we performed, we did last year, late in the year, and that was to take the Baldwin prototype and to site adapt that to fit somewhere on this existing site. So the third option was a new school facility based on the Baldwin prototype at the existing site. It did not include tearing down the existing facility, but it did include the site development costs and the cost to build the new facility somewhere similar to what was done at Baldwin, somewhere on site that would fit. And we didn't go too deep into where that would fit yet. So the costs on the third option, third task, came in at $60,847,000, estimated in 2021 dollars. Next slide.
So, Bill, to just kind of make this point to everybody, options 2 and 3 roughly are the same size, scope, and complexity. Item 2 is still a 650, so you're 400 students under capacity. So you need a trailer park for 400 students at capacity, if you think about it that way. And you still, in the 2025 timeframe, have to build a facility, which I think you're going to talk about that escalated cost in out year dollars.
Yes, that can get staggering. So just on option 2, test 2, to change the ed program at the existing Ginny Dean, expand the building footprint, renovate the interiors. There was approximately $500,000 of temporary classroom costs and trailer costs associated with that because of the phasing of how those renovations would be sequenced. We also were asked to project on an annual basis, taking these costs of these 3 options into $2028, I believe, 2026. Some of those projections, when you compound the escalation on an annual basis at approximately an average of 5%, some of those numbers were staggering in terms of the cost. And I don't think we have a slide that shows that tonight, but I know that there was one that existed. Is there any way that we could get that up on this?
Well, actually, on that slide you just showed,
Yes, sir.
just to be clear, option 2 does not include a new school, it just includes a renovation and an addition. Is that what option 2 is?
Option 2 is renovations to the existing and additions, as well as a fairly major site effort to bring the facility up to current standards.
And a grade change too.
And a educational program change.
Options 2 and 3 end up with the same educational environment at approximately the same time. The operational issue with option 2 is you are trying to educate children in the same school for several years that you are renovating, which is why, as Bill talked about, there's a lot of trailer costs associated with, okay, this week Mrs. Smith's class is going to be in the trailers, next week it's going to be Mrs. Jones' class. I mean, I'd be exaggerating, but you understand how the complexities of that come into play. It becomes a real issue with lunch for children and a lot of other issues that, Andy, you started going off on some of those as far as we talked about.
I'm sorry, I'm not clear. So you're saying you're going to increase capacity from, what, 695 to 1,000? And you're going to go 4th through 6th grade. It will no longer be K through 3 there? So where will those children go?
It's not K3 now. All the schools are K4 right now.
Okay.
5 elementary schools are presently K4.
Right.
With 5, 6, and then the other 5, 6 at Baldwin, which is a dual-purpose school. The ultimate capacity we're talking about is that the 4 at that point elementary schools would be K3 or pre-K3, depending on how we choose to use the pre-K environment. 2, 4, 5, 6 buildings, which would be Mayfield and New Dean. Mets would remain as 7, 8, and of course, Osborne would remain the comprehensive 9, 12 high school.
So you're changing all the schools, all the elementary schools?
Correct, that's always been the plan.
Okay, even with option 3?
Yes.
This is what this was designed to be from the get-go.
So Scott, would you just say that one more time, so we all understand the movement
Y'all
of
want me
students
to-
in grade?
Wow. And
This
the
is your
camera's on, I have to
test.
repeat myself.
Yes,
It's gonna
sir.
be hard. So the grade configure at the ultimate end state is 4 K3 elementary schools or pre-K3 elementary schools, 2, 5, 6 buildings, Mayfield and New Dean. I'm sorry, 4, 5, 6 buildings, 2, 4, 5, 6, Mayfield and New Dean. Mets would remain 7, 8. Osborne would remain 9, 12. The superintendent says, reminded me, the pre-K is most likely going to go to Baldwin in the capacity that's left over there.
Consolidate the entire city.
We would have to redistrict the entire city again. Hopefully tweak it, but it's just as we did last time, so that the numbers fit.
And that's not a change. That's what the plan has been for about 2 or 3 years.
At least.
In looking beyond 2021 dollars that options 2 and 3 are referenced here on the slide, when you compound that out to based upon an average of say 5% escalation per annum in the construction market, it, I believe, approaches $76 million in terms of the math. And again, nobody knows what's going to happen with that market. We know that it will escalate. We know that it could possibly de-escalate, and you may get lucky. It's happened before. But that's not advice that I want to give.
It is 76 million.
And
What was the $76 million number?
that would be the cost for the new facility escalated out to the year of
2026.
2026. Yes.
So in essence, Mr. Mayor, the cost of delaying 5 years in then-year dollars is $15 million.
May I ask a question? Can you go back to the chart just a minute? Sorry.
No worries.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Just a short question and then maybe a statement. Option 2, I think you indicated that the cost of trailers in there, was in there, I think you mentioned something like $500,000 for trailers. Was that in the 55 million number?
Yes, it is.
Okay. It is in-
Those are not capacity trailers, Mr. Mayor. Those are trailers associated with moving children so you can work in a building.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get into the weeds here, and I understand that. For me, at least, it makes perfect sense to invest in something new as opposed to invest in something old, and that's just me.
So just to bring some clarity, these numbers that we've arrived at are total project costs. Both hard construction, which is the big fees, and the soft costs. Any design fees, FF&E, technology, those types of costs, moving costs. And I'm here as a resource tonight. I understand these are very difficult issues to grapple with, and I'm here to assist and to try to bring whatever expertise I can assist you with in your deliberations. The slide that just came up is projections in terms of escalation costs, but we're taking the average, which is a historical state average, based upon I believe, a 20-year trend of 4.61%. We've used that number and applied it in out years past 2021, and that is the compounding effect of the map. So you see in the year 2026, the project total cost is estimated to be just over $76 million.
And if you look at that, what Bill was talking about, the hard costs are where your biggest jump is as well, not the soft costs.
That is correct.
And 461 is the average over how long?
It's over 20 years.
Over 20 years.
As average.
So it could be less,
It could be less,
but it could be a lot more too.
it could be more.
Thank you. Is that it, Mr. Down? Okay,
Yes.
any questions for Mr. Down? Questions? Thank you. So I'm just writing some notes here. So in 2021, 56 million for renovation expansion, or 61 million for a new school,
Yes, sir.
for the purposes of some of the stuff
Those
we're
are
going to
the
be doing.
estimates of
Thank you.
probable cost. Realistic estimates.
Understood. Okay, for the purpose of keeping things moving along, we are on item 2.2.
The other thing I observed, to everybody here, $76 million cost associated with the 5-year delay. Don't forget to add in that $4 million we need to renovate Dean. And there's probably another $1.5 million in trailers associated with capacity over that 5-year period. So 76 is north of 80. So it's really not a $15 million increase. It's closer to 20 when you think about it in that net real impact to the city.
Okay, to keep things moving along, 2.2, discussion of Dean funding scenarios. And we have some information, I think, from Davenport. Did you want to talk about that?
I'll talk just while Diane's handing it out.
Oh, I don't think so.
Cover this, what you're getting, and we did send this out ahead of time, so this is just the same thing that we had.
Oh, okay.
We just
I don't know.
We asked Davenport to give us updated numbers based on the two scenarios that the schools had proposed. And in this case, the numbers we had was roughly 60 million to build it in 2020, 2021, and 76 million to build it in 2025, 26. And using an assumed interest rate of 4.5% per year. And then the two scenarios that are in the package, scenario school case 1 is if we wanted to build that facility earlier in the 21-22 time frame. If you're looking at the columns, and you've seen these before, but basically just to walk through what they did, the existing debt service is column B. That's what we're paying on all school projects right now. The CIP debt service is the new debt service that would be related to to do Dean School, and so you get a total in D. the revenue sources that were being used there was assuming, based on what we understood, is that the school system was trying to build that capacity with the additional state funds and some one-time funds, at least in the next 2 years, back to the level that you had in 2018 at that 7.3 million. So we just assumed a straight line, maintaining that level of debt service to pay for the debt. And then you can see, so that's the revenues that are currently available, potentially currently available. Column G shows the surplus or deficit over the next several years. And then they've estimated a tax impact to fund that project now of 2 ways you could do it. You could do incremental tax increases of 3.6 cents in 2021 and 3.5 cents in 2022, or you could do which is 7 cents, or you could do a one-time 5-cent increase in 2020, and that would give you the debt capacity to fund this school at this, or the fund is $60 million worth of school at Denton. Okay, and then the scenario 2 basically is all those are the same except for the CIP debt service. Assume that you're going to put off Dean until 2026 in terms of building it. Your capacity would actually, your debt, the amount of money that you would need on an incremental basis would be 3.6 if you just did it just as you ran into deficits. Again, with all the same assumptions we had before. Or in 2020, if we had added an additional 1.1 cents, or roughly about $500,000 to our debt capacity, you could fund this project at the $75 million. It's actually 72.8, plus there's a $2 million that was being projected for the needed for the administrative building. So they included all of the debt service that the schools were looking for. So there's a little bit extra in there in both those scenarios, the 2.1 million for renovation of the admin building for the school system. So the short answer to that again is to build it in the delayed schedule with a setting aside the same amount of money for debt service that we're setting aside now, or we're setting aside in 18 for the schools. You could either add about another $500,000 to that next year, moving forward throughout the life of this, or you could look at some increases back in the future years, 28, 29. And then school case 1 would be funding the debt service to do that now, which would be roughly $2.5 million of additional impact you'd have to come up with in the short term.
Can you explain line 37 on that page 1, please? You've got a one-time.
The one-time impact, again, the way we typically try to do debt service management with Davenport is you can either fund debt exactly when you need it, and that'll be at a higher rate, or you can basically build up reserves so that money's available and it results in a lower overall debt amount. So the line 37 means if we adopted, that basically shows you the amount of money you need to add to our debt service capacity in order to fund Dean. The 5 cents to fund it or $2.5 million roughly, 2.4 to fund it in 21, and then in 25, 26, you need to add about $500,000 a year. Does that make sense?
Well, so line 37 is not inclusive in
it's an alternative.
It's an alternative to the 3.6, 3.5. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. It's an
Okay,
alternative.
they're not additive.
No.
So you really have 3 scenarios here. You have one, which is 3.6, 3.5.
Right.
You have the second one, which is 0.3, 3.3, 3.6.
Correct.
Or you have the FY 2020 one-time 5 cents. Is that
Or
the other one too.
Would be 1.1.
Got it. And this is from Davenport.
This is all Davenport's numbers, basically putting in those assumptions and then just giving us, all we're solving for is what is the debt capacity, debt service amount that we need to actually fund
Just the school?
this school.
This is just
with this
capital?
number.
This is
Just
an operating,
capital.
nothing else? Questions on that, ladies and gentlemen?
I've got one. Just
Mayor?
want to make sure, I'm pretty sure that you've got this, but that includes all of the existing debt for the schools, for the buildings that they have out there now, all the existing debt plus the new debt.
That's correct.
Okay.
He's in the model,
Right.
existing
Really?
debt and the new debt.
As Mr. Bainey indicated, you've got 4 different potential options.
And that includes, to the mayor's point, that includes the whole capital program that the schools have.
Yes, right now, the 5-year program that the schools have has 2 bonded projects in there. $2 million, which is a partial funding of the admin building, and then the 2 amounts that we talked about, either for Dean.
So yes.
Either 58 million, actually 58 million, or 73 million.
Okay.
Really two technical alternatives from my way of thinking. Building a school in 2020 or 2025, whatever the precise numbers were, and then each one has a permutation associated with how the city chooses to implement its taxing authority.
Yes.
Okay.
In essence, the school board had been making that decision based on how you were allocating the funds that were given to you in the past. Have been determining how much would go to debt versus how much would go to ongoing capital. So I heard Mr. Ellison ask a question. This does not include things like school buses that are in their capital program. This is, so their things that they did as pay-as-you-go are not included in this. This is only debt finance. It's only debt finance.
That exists in the budget currently.
That exists in the current CIP.
The other nuance is to the tax implication, I want to caveat. This is the taxing implication of debt service. Back at the, I'm going to say it was the July 11th meeting, but I would probably get the date wrong. We talked about the net impact of operating cost, and we talked about how, irrespective of capital, our operating costs go up between 3.25 and 3.5% per year because of school enrollment changes. 80% of our budget's caught up in labor. Tied to that, 80% of our budget's in labor. What are the 2 biggest variables we all face that are going at, just like construction, disproportionate to inflation? The Virginia retirement system and healthcare. So we're facing a lot of challenges there. Now there'll be more buses and more fuel and more teachers. The cost of all those things are going up higher than CPI. So again, our operating costs, we predict over the next 10 years are going up 3.25% to 3.5% a year, which is higher than what we currently have built into all the models.
Okay. Questions on 2.2?
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Also, as Mr. Albrecht has said, on putting it off to 2026, we also will have, $4 or $5 million more incurred costs between our having to find room for our kids. So the extra money for redoing Dean, or putting a Band-Aid on Dean, and trailers is another $4 or $5 million that we don't have, which goes away if we do it sooner.
Okay. 2.3, discussion of proposed funding.
Chair, may I ask one more question?
Yes, go ahead, Mayor.
I don't know whether Mr. Downey, you indicated that the cost associated with building a new building, the $60 million, and then it escalates from there based upon when you're going to build it, did not include tearing the old and existing building down.
That is correct, sir.
Got a ballpark on that? Just a ballpark.
Ballpark is probably between $1 million and $1.5 million.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, scenario time. You all are familiar with this sheet. So we have a couple different scenarios to look at. Let's go around. Yes.
I actually put just a handout of questions, and I'm wondering if we could indulge the committee in a little discussion of the premise that's behind our discussion in these scenarios before we do that. So I wonder if I could hand this out and we can maybe have a conversation about that. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. So, does everybody have a copy? Yeah. So, yeah, what I'm asking for is just a little discussion on some of these sort of base issues that I think I would just like to know that we're all on the same page for these, so that as we discuss these proposals, we have a sense of our parameters. So the first question is the term we're looking at a 3-year term? Is everybody sort of agreed that that is what we should be looking at?
I agree that's what I would prefer.
Me as well.
Let me suggest the superintendent needs to begin developing a budget by September. It's August. We continue to kick this can. I'm going to suggest if we can't come to resolution in the next 30 days, we quit talking about a 3-year deal and say it's a 1-year deal, because both of our staffs need to know what they're dealing with.
But let's say for argument's sake, then, Mr. Albrecht, that you and I are on the same page, we're looking at a 3-year deal.
I agree. I'm just, to the last meeting, Mr. Haney talked about, we can read in perpetuity, not quite, you said, sir, but not quite. We know, but we talked about reading to get it right.
Yeah. And I think the reason I'm handing this out, Scott, is because I think maybe our meetings would be more helpful if we had more discussion on topics and less sort of ancillary angst. So deem capital investment priority within, is a capital investment priority within the next 5 years. I mean, that's very much,
At the outside.
right, this is very much a topic of today's presentation.
Looking
You
at
see
these
the
numbers,
cost.
sir, and the escalation, the sooner the better, but yes, I do.
And you can shorten it by just saying deem as a capital investment priority. You don't do 20 years, 5 years.
So this is fast, and it becomes an unfunded priority. I just like the date to say, are we putting it in this planning window we're talking about with respect to the CIP and moving down this path or not? So that we don't get into the Baldwin situation of 8 years later, we're still going, one of these days we're going to build that school. It's a priority.
Yes.
So we're, yes?
Yes.
Funding should be separated by lines to support operational and capital costs. So that's, Dr. Newman, you've been at a couple of these. In the past, all of our funding for the schools has been inclusive. And so part of this committee's dialogue in the first couple of meetings that we had seemed to be trending to the fact that we want to move to an operational consideration and then separate that
So
capital
I
cost.
think you need to be careful of the terms.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we do a non-categorical appropriation from the council to the schools. The city manager even alluded to pay-go capital. What do we mean by the term capital? Do you mean debt service, or do you mean all capital?
Definitely the next bullet point is dealing with debt service. So I think that's a good question, Scott. I think the reason that debt service budgeting should remain level to support long-term needs, one of the things that I noticed looking through the school budgets is that as there were step downs in debt service, that money was allocated into operational. And so we had sort of this, not that it wasn't needed, I'm not suggesting that, except that what it does is it depletes what's available on the debt service side, on the capital investment side, right? And as we're seeing in today's presentation, and one of the pages that we were handed talks about the age the schools are going to be when we look at out years, and those are pretty scary numbers. So what I thought we were discussing as a committee was that we were going to try to level that out and make sure that a long-term capital investment plan was in fact being funded. So back to this bullet point, yeah, I mean, I think my suggestion is that capital is probably debt service, and that the pay-go is probably in your operational expenditures.
Okay, I don't see the FAGO in our operational, that's in our CIP. Your line here saying funding should be separated by lines to support operational and capital. If that said operational and debt service, I could probably live with it. I'm willing to compromise. As an elected body, I think funding should be handled by the school board.
Absolutely, I'm not trying to get into that.
No, but I don't have a problem with separating out debt service and operational. But the rest of our capital is different. You know, when we're talking about buses and things like that, we have to have control over that and know what we're doing. As far as because we do know what we're doing. As far as the debt service, especially when we're going to be building such a mammoth-priced building, which is desperately needed, I have no problem with separating those two out. The debt service and operational. The debt service and everything else.
I guess I just asked, what's the desired outcome of the separation? I mean, the Constitution says the local government will need a needs-based appropriation. It doesn't talk about debt service or anything. It says what are the needs. Depending upon how you look at it, the enacted budget, the final budget, whatever, we ended up last year, the year that ended June 30, and the amount of that reduction in debt service, while it was appropriated into the operating fund at the start of the year, was transferred into the designated fund balance at the end of the year. So the schools need some level of flexibility for operations as the year continues. I just asked what the desired, I don't want to say it's not, I don't think it's a trust thing, so I'm just wondering what the council would
I
expect out
can
of
say,
that.
the way that I've understood our discussions, and actually the way I look at Davenport's numbers today, is there's a big difference in tax impact to our citizens if that debt service is leveled out, smoothed out, looking down the road. And so the purpose of this committee to advise council who's going to make these taxing decisions, I think if we can come to some agreement that that debt service is going to be protected at a certain line and level, then it's easier for us to make decisions when we're going to build the school and what that is. And so that's really the purpose. The same thing that we did with the CIP on the city side, which was we knew we had to take the taxes to a level to smooth that out so that we could fund the CIP. You're in my eye line. We've had this discussion a couple of times.
We have.
Which Davenport recognized as being a very important part of saving the citizens money and achieving a AAA bond rating for the city. And so we're asking for a similar commitment, I think, on that line from the school board.
So I think that's, as I understand your ask, it's to codify what, so 3 years ago, Mr. Bushmel may or may not have said, he made a promise. And I think, Ken, what you're suggesting is we codify that the expectation is that $1.6 million, roughly, of reduced debt service because of level principal is not appropriated every year, or if it is appropriated, it's appropriated into a designated fund balance associated with routine.
Exactly.
Not that you're making a categorical appropriation, we just said that over the 3-year term or term of the life of this agreement, here's what our mutual expectation and promise is.
And I think there's another dimension to it, Scott, because I think we're on the same page, which is looking at your debt service, 2022, we have a step down in your cost, but we're saying level that out, keep that money in capital expenditures, looking at these schools. So that's not getting, right, that we're dealing in a way with operations in a different manner. And that as that debt service steps down, it remains a part of your plan to bank it. So that the next school and the next school and the next school isn't the same conversation.
I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation myself. I think that says, that's doing what's right for the city, which is, associated with the enrollment, associated with the city, we can only afford so much debt service. So,
Mr. Page.
Just to help Mr. Elston, when you go back and look, we went back and look at what the categories are that council can appropriate funds by. And one category actually is debt service and transfers, and another one is facilities. So the state statutes don't actually call anything capital. They divide those two out into those areas, debt service and facilities. And then there's a whole series of operational, instructional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that administrative, whatever.
So your edit is not only appropriate, it is also legal.
Me being legal, huh? Did I give you something?
Hand that size coming into your orbit, that's a scary thing. So these were my bullet points, and I appreciate the committee's leeway in sort of going through this kind of understanding. Am I missing anything that anybody else thinks ought to be fundamental in our discussion before we move down to these next sort of three, if we can?
I guess I go back to number 2 and say, I've never met a politician who isn't for public education until it comes time to vote on it. So we can all say New Dean is a priority, but are we willing to commit to building that school for 2020-2021 beneficial use?
Well, the hope is that by the time we get to the end of this list,
There's no way you can build that school by 2020.
Right.
They better be digging a hole right now.
the hope, Scott, is that by the time we get to the end of this list, we can actually start to talk about what we think is sufficient, okay? A level of sufficiency. But is there another sort of fundamental premise that may be missing as we sort of in this negotiation? Or have we sort of captured it?
Why don't you keep going, Ken, we'll come up with that.
So then I have these sort of central questions, right, that I think we can tackle one by one, but this gets to your concerns, I think, right? How do we plan to accommodate a potential financial downturn? And what might define a mechanism to assure long-term planning and protect against undue pressure in the budget cycle? That was the crux of the proposal that I made, and we never really discussed it. But I would like to make certain that in whatever we put forward, there is something that says, yes, we think we're doing this. But if we get into a 2007, 2005 crunch, we have a way of knowing where we're going to go, a way of helping us to have that discussion and a way of helping our financial folks know how they are expected to plan if such a downturn occurs, which I think is likely. And then we talked about enrollment, capital needs, cost increases, which includes salaries, in my mind, to be the main budget drivers. And so that gives us these other sub-questions, right? Should enrollment projections and per pupil cost determine the city contribution? That was Mr. Wolf, and he's not here now. That was, as I understood it, sort of the crux of his proposal was let's just go to this other form of funding. Might a long-term investment plan be devised, and how far out? You guys already did that. You started giving us those schools, and we see those numbers. And oh my goodness, an 80-year-old school is going to have other financial implications. So we best get on it. So thank you for putting that forward. And what minimum percentage growth defines sufficiency? Because we have in these proposals, and I know Mr. Avani wants to get to this sheet, in those proposals, we've got a wide range from 2.65 to 3.5 of incremental growth to the school budget. So can we come to a place, a number that we think is sufficient on the operational side and on the capital side, which Davenport's been nice enough to sort of give us, that we can then move forward towards a vote. And then maybe after we've had this conversation, we can get to this page and start to look at what are the characteristics of various proposals that maybe should be extracted and retained as we come to, I hope, some sort of conclusion. So, can we come to a plan to accommodate a mechanism I've been referring to in sort of my own shorthand as a safety mechanism that says we have a downturn, we're going to agree that it's going to affect funding. The one that I outlined gives a 2-year slide to the schools in both directions, which puts budget planning on, in terms of that growth, on the actual, which puts you on a 2-year cycle. And I understand Andy's not entirely happy and comfortable with that scenario. She said it. But, no, because you did say we. And my question to our finance director was, does this give you angst? And why?
Well, I'll tell you my concern about your plan as far as going back to you. So let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that let's assume we're going back now looking at the 2017 audited financial statements, and it shows that between 2016 and 2017, the city's revenue growth went up 4%, right? Under your plan, the school board would get 4% increase, right?
3.5.
Or 3.5, or whatever it is, right? But Mr. Page is sitting here with his Commissioner of Revenue and everybody, and they're saying that the real estate we're in a recessionary period now, and the market is going down, and the city's not going to get 3.5% or 4% increase like it experienced in 2017. So even though we're following the plan that you put forward and we're doing everything we're supposed to, the city still doesn't have the funding to be able to support that rate of growth. On the other hand, if you're looking on my side of the fence and I'm with the schools, the city could be booming and moving at 5%, but we're going back to a recessionary period, and the school's still getting 1% or no percent increase, even though the city's revenues are jumping higher over that period of time. I mean, I like your plan generally, but when you go back 2 years, a lot of things can happen during that period of time with as far as the housing market and how things are valued in the recession and whatever. Mr. Payne and I were talking a little bit today about we're living through now, I think, the longest expansion period in United States history. It's much more likely in the next 5 years for the market to turn downward instead of continuing going forward. And so your point about, well, what are we going to do if to accommodate have a financial downturn is something I think is very important to discuss, because I don't, we don't have history on our side that this economic expansion is going to continue forever. So.
Right. No, I appreciate that, and I'm perfectly willing to believe that I have overthought it. The formula that I've come up with is maybe a little too complex. I'm perfectly willing to believe.
I really like the idea about going back to audited financial statements. It stops and it takes into account all of the taxes that have been raised during that period of time. So I've just pointed out the one thing that I'm concerned about your plan. All the other stuff about it I really like. I mean, because it's verifiable data, it's all the taxes, it's talking about the increase. That if the whole city is rising up, then everybody rises. Rising tide rises all boats. And if it's going down, everybody goes down the same. So I generally speaking like that. Going back 2 years, though, is a long time. Maybe there's some middle ground with that. Maybe we go back 1 year and go on unaudited financial.
Okay, so it's almost 6 o'clock. Thank you, Andy. Excuse me. It's almost 6 o'clock. Thank you, Mr. Almost 7. Excuse me. So we've been doing this for an hour, so we do need to kind of move on here. I think Mr. Elston made some good points, especially in the top section there in the bullets that we've talked
Can we deal with
about.
that next bullet, though? Because I think it's very important to the discussion, which is we have a proposal, or we can go proposal by proposal.
We're gonna go through this. I'm gonna suggest that we follow the
Because
agenda.
you're taking the floor back from me. If you're taking the floor back, I just want to know that we're going back. I want to know before you do that, because I haven't ceded the floor to you, that we're going through these bullets.
We are following the agenda, Mr. Elston, and we're going on to the discussion of the proposed funding scenarios. That's where we're going.
Right.
So we will probably come back to this.
Fantastic. Thank you, sir.
So if you look at the scenarios, you all are familiar certainly with the top 3 or 4. Just to be clear, we have now 6. And to recap briefly, this committee recommended by a 4-2 vote scenario 4, which was to fund operating and capital at 3.5 cents and to handle Dean separately. That went to the council. The council rejected that. It said any proposal must include Dean. Since that time, we have discussed two other proposals. Scenario 5, which is a bit of a revision, which looks at that including Dean at the same amount. That discussion has occurred, and there was no motion made. It was just discussed. Mr. Wolf, at our last meeting, suggested what he calls a roadmap. Some of his principles, I think, are included in what Mr. Elston presented. Certainly the idea that there be separate funding to support operation and capital, and you see, and Dean is a priority. I think he made that very clear, and you see kind of his proposal there. At this point, I would say that the committee needs to do something and make some type of recommendation to council. I think at some point, council is going to need to Mr. DeMaria's point last time we met, if we can't make a decision, then council's going to need to meet as a group and make that decision. You know, I think that's kind of where we are now. I'm not opposed to having a discussion on the comments that Mr. Elston has, which I think are good conversations. I think they're long conversations. I don't know that we end them tonight. Go ahead.
Can I
Yeah,
answer
go ahead.
that? Because I think these are the needed conversations. I think these are the conversations, from my perspective, that have been absent from this committee's meeting. I don't think they have to be long, because we might actually find we're agreed. We just had a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. I know that the actuals maybe should be mentioned in our agreement because it's helpful to you, that the 2-year cycle is a little bit scary, but a mechanism that captures downturn for us and allows us a bottom, so the school knows there's a floor, they're not going past the floor, and we know we're not going to have a great big jump because we made a promise we can't keep. That was a quick conversation. I think we got something.
So which of these scenarios are you referring to then with that?
Well, I'm still at the central agreement phase. If we are all agreed that that's important, we now have something on the table we can articulate. It may be part of the 1, 2, 3 that's on this, which is number 3, but it may not be all of number 3, right? Because I think that...
Number 3 doesn't include Dean.
So if we've talked about separating these two, and we're now talking about operating, right? Debt service and facilities being on this other line, that now the question, I just think it's important, I'm not trying to carry water for Mr. Wolf, but he did make an offer, he did a lot of work. Does the committee suggest that we should change our entire funding structure to go away from these percentages to a per pupil funding scale, which I think, Mr. Beatty, is probably a very long conversation to define what that might be. But I just want to know if people want to do that, or if we can get back to, here's a percentage that we can live with, plus this for debt service, we can get going. But I think it's an important question.
We had many of these discussions with respect to funding on a per pupil basis 3 years ago. At its root, I think the schools like the idea, because it puts responsibility for the funding of the schools back with the council, who make land use decisions. Many of the problems we live with today are based upon decisions made by previous councils 5 and 10 years ago with respect to land use, housing, and the number of children that now come out of those housing units. That said, in this exact series of meetings, council has suggested that the documents filed for the state by the former superintendent couldn't possibly be right. So I worry they will never agree upon what a student is. And that was the problem we had 3 years ago, sir, is that we filed data that says as of September 30, enrollment is X. The reality is kids come, kids go, it's a moving target, it's really hard, what do we mean by it? I think we'll spend more time defining what's a student than maybe proved.
So could we then take up the next one, which is what is a minimum percentage growth that defines sufficiency for the school? Because if we can agree on that, then we can start talking about Dean, right? For instance, may I, Mr. Mayor, you said 3.5 came forward, this is what he said on Monday in this room at a work session. 3.5 came forward, but it included Dean. What might that look like? You know, is that a 3% increase, on the one side, 0.5 on debt service. We might have votes for that. Does that represent sufficiency? Since I took office, I've been saying the primary question is sufficiency. So, I'm not
Are
suggesting.
you making a
that's-
motion for scenario 5?
I am not yet there. I'm still trying to have a conversation as a committee. I think we keep jumping to scenarios and tax impacts and all these things that are actually keeping us from some fundamental foundational understanding that could build consensus. So I'm trying to build a consensus around what sufficiency might be.
And I appreciate how you clarified the per pupil amount, because I wasn't on council at the time of the last agreement and didn't know about those conversations. So I understand where you're coming from with that as well. Even though it could be a likely scenario for the schools to think about, there is that danger of ever getting to what a pupil is and how much is per, and I understand, and I get that. So thank you for clarifying that. I really wanted to reiterate once again.
Yeah, that's helpful, because
It is.
we have a very big,
work session.
yeah, we have a big proposal around it.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I think we're back to sort of these proposals on this sheet that all kind of come down to what is the percentage growth and what is a sufficient number. With that 3.5%, if 3% went to operational, 0.5 went to debt service, would that satisfy the needs of the schools in general?
That depends upon when you build team. Because there's that $4 million elephant in the room associated with deferring that investment. And who's paying for that? And actually, it's more like a $6 million elephant, because you've got to buy some trailers at capacity too.
And then by the time you wait to build it, we're going to be saving as much money as the more it's costing us. I mean, we're not going to gain anything.
At some point, I think, the conversation is a good, healthy one. At some point, you all, meaning the schools, are going to have to decide, where that line between operating and capital divides. I think I heard pretty clearly that you're not interested in us telling you that. So what a percentage does is says, this is how much you're going to get. You all are going to have to make those decisions, but recognizing that this is how much you get, and so within that amount, you're going to be making those decisions. We can certainly talk about that, but I'm more interested in looking at a percentage that you all would be expected to manage for operating and capital.
Without the debt service?
I think to include Dean, I think anything that we would do would include operating and capital, include Dean. That's pretty clearly what the council said at the end of our work session.
Let me try to recap.
And then I want to ask Diane a question.
Your question might help me, so it's only a question.
So, because Mr. Albright said it depends on when we build D. We haven't gotten to these new scenarios that we were presented with by Davenport today, but certainly a 1.1 cent increase is more attractive to some of us than 7 cents, 10 cents, some of these other things. So, let's say, for the sake of this question that I'm asking you, not our vote, if that's the scenario we want to hone in on, is 0.5% getting us there, or are we as a council looking for something else to fill in that gap? Does 0.5% gets us half a smart, but that's what I wondered. It does sort of 1 for 1, it's half a cent. So we need
Roughly,
another.
we need a $500,000. If you put $500,000 aside, additional to what the schools have been putting into debt service, if the council came up with another $500,000, we could build Dean in 25, 26, assuming these numbers are all stay correct.
So one of go ahead, I'm
So
sorry.
it's basically
I didn't mean to interrupt
1%.
you.
Just the cost of Dean, though, I don't have the renovations for that, for the $5 million.
Well,
They're not included, if we were to bond those, they're not included in this debt service for the half cent.
And the renovations of the Band-Aid, not major renovation plan.
Right. So, just so people at the table understand, if we were to say, I'm not saying we're there yet, but if we were to say 3.5, 3% of it is operational, 0.5 is going to debt service, the council still has to find 0.5 to go into that debt service, whether that's, as Mr. Wolf, I think, says, is coming from our library, in the CIP or whatever, but as we all know, and have known for a long time, there are other challenges ahead
You're
of us.
3 and 0.5 with a 0.5% going to debt service. That's in addition to the level payment delta we know is debt service, or is that in place of?
It's a contribution to it. I mean, we're trying to even out that line. So in terms of these two pieces that we're talking about, the suggestion, and I don't know where we are in this paper, I'm talking philosophically here, right? A 3% operational line and a 0.5% debt service line gives us a way to guide the council to that 3.5 proposal. We know as a council, there's still a 0.5 delta to get to the capital costs. That
For 2026.
to get to the capital costs starting in 2020.
Every
We're looking at
operating,
that one
Build
cent
it
in
in
2020.
2026.
Building in 2026.
so my fear is every operating scenario we gave you based upon projected enrollment, operating and paygo, and that each scenario you assume that the $1.6 million could go into the designated fund balance. Showed an annual operating increase between 3.25% and 3.5%. So you're putting us at risk for up to 0.5%.
So the question is there movement? Right? These are great and very detailed budgets. We've gone through them. We've had experts help us through them. And what I still don't know, Mr. Albrecht, is there movement? Is there a way for the schools to say, we will tighten this budget? We have things we can cut. We have things we can reduce that isn't going to negatively impact the education of our students. So yes, I suppose that's what I'm saying. If we ultimately came back with the sufficiency line that we see as 3% on operation, what happens to the schools?
Will you be willing to analyze that with the 3.5? I'm going to put one equivocation, and that is the $6 million non-recurring cost associated with renovating Dean and trailers is a supplemental appropriation. Because you can't suck up that within that 3% operating. And that's the cost of delaying Dean. I'm assuming that all the scenarios based upon what we just talked about are delaying Dean in 2026.
That is right? That's what we all understand. I just want to be clear here.
If you're,
That's what they show.
Yeah, so
That's what they show.
1.1 cent in 2020 delays it to 2026. So
At some point, I'm gonna advocate here maybe for a break in a second, because we've been doing this for an hour and a half. At some point, speaking for myself, and to some extent what the council rejected, was what I heard clearly when the council did this in a work session, was we were interested in funding operating, capital, whether you want to call it PAYGO and Dean, all as one. When you start breaking out, costs for this and costs for that, that kind of complicates the matter. I understand you have concerns because you've done your analysis and you're probably worried that a certain percentage is not enough, and if you add trailers and school buses, it gets more. But what I'm advocating for is you all look at that figure and give us a figure that is, this is what we feel is the percentage we need to do those three things which council has said, and then we further have that discussion. It sounds like you're hovering around 3.5 cents, but you've got some concerns.
I don't determine tax rates, or the council does.
Well, 3.5 cents to do the things that you've talked about, just to move the conversation forward. I think that's what I don't want to
We're
put words in
talking
your mouth.
percents.
Well, I'm talking scenario 5, which is 3.5 cents and also 3.5%. It's the same. Yeah.
So, am I correct that roughly a 1% transfer increase to the schools for $500,000? Is that right?
Yes, 1%,
is $500,000.
roughly, yes.
So we've identified a $6 million problem over a 3-year period, potentially to renovate Dean and to put those trailers. That's $2 million a year. That's 4% more over and above the 3%. So I think we're kind of further up than you think we are.
So the beginning of that assumption,
You know, that's back of the envelope numbers. Like
the beginning of that assumption begins with option 2? Is that what you're saying? If you were to renovate Dean and increase capacity, which is option 2.
We're looking at option 3.
Okay, option 3 is a replacement.
Both are 2020.
What options are you talking about on,
Yeah, which one are you?
no, which one are you talking about?
Well, I'm trying to understand, you're making an assumption that you're going to need $4 million extra each year.
No, $6 million over the 3-year period. $4 million to renovate Dean to extend its useful life to 2026. And $2 million more roughly, these are back of the envelope guesses, in trailers for increased capacity associated with the capacity we need starting in 2020, 2021, that we will not have online until 2026 to house students at the 5-6 grade level.
To achieve option 3 in 20...
To achieve option 2 or 3, doesn't matter, in 2026, to provide that need.
And at this point, I think all that would have to come out of pay because we don't have any, there's no debt in
For
place
that.
for that.
You know, I'm thinking about this. There's not enough pay go to do that.
We probably got a couple trailers in there, but we sure don't have any money to extend Dean 5 years. And we probably don't have enough trailers either.
Okay, so, forgive me, you like scenario 5 if we could deal with the $6 million issue that you're talking about. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just to
That
keep
is the
things...
That's the elephant, is the deferral of Dean. That becomes a huge elephant.
So what you're saying is you can pay for Dean, you can fund your operating, and most of your capital.
An option in scenario 5, as presented, if the intent is 3% with a 0.5%, I believe we can live within the intent to include the movement of debt service as we know it, to the intent that Mr.
Wolf originally.
That's right, Mr. Elson was just talking about.
No, that's not, Mr. Go ahead. I don't, that's not
I'm
muddy
thinking
the
of
waters. It's what I just said,
Is
is
what
what you're
Mr.
talking
Elson
about,
said,
yeah?
yes. But we haven't addressed Dean renovations. I mean, they have to be done. I mean, some of them, school will shut down and we will not be able to continue at some point in the foreseeable future.
So you're saying there's a 4 million,
Option 1 added to that.
That's right, that's right.
So you're adding option 1.
Option 1 is a must-do if you are not going to meet our original plan of Dean Online by 2021. You're going to extend that to 2026, which is what everything we said is based upon the funding ability and the paying ability, then you must do option 1.
because your plan calls for breaking ground on being this year?
Next year.
Next year. So we intentionally have not done many upgrades to Dean.
Right.
There are HVAC systems, there's electrical issue, there's problems with bathrooms, none of which are a problem, right, something right, none of which are a problem for a year, 2 or 3. Make it 7, 8, 9, it's a real issue. And as Mr. Downey said, go 10 years and you put another $1.5 million into a roof. Unless you want to start issuing buckets again.
Okay, so let me just summarize. So what I'm hearing you say is scenario 5, which is 3.5 cents and 3.5% each year, 20, 21, 22, as well as you're saying you need to do limited improvements to Jenny Dean for deferred maintenance and code compliance.
I'm just being fully transparent that an option, scenario 5, and I think that's a very valid thing, but we've all got to recognize there is still an elephant we mutually have to address, because we cannot do that within the 3% with the 0.5% extra going towards designated future funding of debt. It can't be done.
May I? So, I cannot speak for the council, I can only speak for my vote on the council. But if we were to then, in our considerations, move another 0.5% from our CIP, from the city's CIP, that would get us to that increase in 2020 to build it. Does it also help us with that delta? And now you're talking about 4%. Wouldn't that get us there?
If you're asking if we changed it so that the schools are getting 3% for operating, and you're taking 1% and adding it to debt service.
No, I think he's saying you make a scenario 7 and you make it 4%, or 4 cents.
Well,
Is that what you're saying?
What I'm suggesting.
You still split it out.
You said it, because we're trying to divide, we're trying to create 2 lines, right? So it would be 3% growth on the operating side, and then we're looking at debt service. And we're talking now transparently about taxes, right? So,
Yeah, my sense is there's lots of moving parts here. The
is
logical
Elizabeth
part of that.
still here? Because she's going to be mad that I just said that.
But on that scenario, if you're saying 3% for operating, and then another 1%, or basically $500,000 we're going to add towards debt, to build the debt service up, then I think the issue probably is we need to have some discussions between the 2 staffs of what that means in terms of the availability of PAYGO money to fund the things you're doing. That doesn't immediately give the $4 million or $6 million or whatever money for Dean, just if you take the assumptions that are being on the table. But that doesn't mean you can't look. There is some money, I think, in your PAYGO right now that's allocated towards Dean.
Well, but yeah, I think that's in there, right?
There's some of that.
And
I don't know if it's
76
6, but I think
million amortized over 20 years, adding 4 million to that may not be that, right? We may be in with some breathing room that allows us to shave back on that. So again, I'm not looking for a commitment.
Like instead of, we can add another 4, and quite honestly, we think the numbers have changed from the last time we had in terms of the total amount. So, but if you go back in and increase the amount we're paying for Dean, if you add $4, $5, $6, $8 million to the Dean cost, then that incrementally, if you do that as debt, is a lower number than just paying for it with straight PAYGO cash.
So from my perspective as a councilman, I would be willing to have that conversation, dig into those numbers, if we could also look at the safety mechanism and give it some definition.
Just to keep the conversation going here on Mr. Ellison's suggestion, and maybe I'm oversimplifying, but what I'm hearing is instead of 3.5 cents, you're looking at more 4 cents. Or some version of that.
That is not the suggestion that I made.
Well,
Just
okay,
to be clear,
that's what I'm- okay.
to be real
But-
clear, the suggestion that I made from this page
Right.
would be that it's a 3.5 as suggested. 3% is going operating, 0.5 is going to debt service, leaving a delta that then we would start to take up, looking at the numbers, seeing what's already built in, because I think some of it is, what that is amortized over 20, 30 years, that's what I'm talking about.
But you're still not, I respect what you're saying. My point is you're still not dealing with the total issue, which was.
Well, we're agreeing to dig in to that $4 million bubble. It's a $4 million bubble.
It might not be that big, so I think, and I respect Mr. Avini's been here an hour and a half. I think staff could look at 2 new scenarios. One is how much could we mutually save if we can agree to borrow money in 2020 to build that school in 2021 to get that beneficial use in what the schools are presently saving. We have about $1 million, $1.5 million in our CIP also ending if we didn't spend it, to say we don't have to spend that $4 million. And to your point, what else could the city contribute in ongoing PAYGO over the next 3 years? How big of a, for lack of a better word, down payment do we have, and what does the operational impact of the city then begin in 2021? Is it enough to forego that cost of escalation? Is it enough that it becomes attractive?
If that's, okay, I can agree to that if that's worked into a scenario. Okay, so there would be a final scenario that would include all of those items, is where I'm going.
I think that's
I could agree to that. Just one quick call. Is there any option one, can we avoid option one by doing something within a certain number of years? What's the, option one exists because of the 2025 timeframe, is that correct?
Option one, because right, to extend being beyond 2021, you must do option one.
So beyond 2021, you must do,
Right. Which is
Well,
which is what the current, roughly, that's the current plan now. to replace it.
Just to be,
So how we got to these options, you have to remember how we got to where we are. So for last time Davenport was here, they said, so the city had the capacity to borrow money, but we might not have the ability to pay the money all at one time for Dean, right? We were talking 10-cent increases at the time. So what we did was, is we asked Downey and Scott to go out there and look at Dean and tell us what the building would need until we could get a new Dean built. And so if we postpone Dean 5 years, right? So we were supposed to break ground next summer, so that would be 2020. So we would not start building Dean until 2025. It would take 2 years to at least to get Dean built, so we're at 27 or so now. So right now, we're living in 18, and we're moving all the way out to 2027. So it's almost a 10-year period of time of where we'd have to go. So he's telling us how much money we would have to spend on Dean to make it through those 10-year period of time. That's how the $4 million got there. Right?
That is correct.
okay.
So that was his charge, was to tell us how we could live until we could get the new Dean built. Because it was our understanding that we were going to postpone Dean. So now we're backing up and saying, now we're going to try to figure out a way to do it in we're going to go back to the original schedule, I guess, and start.
You're talking about doing all those improvements next year? When does that $4 million?
Well, no, he's got it broken out over the whole time period of time.
You could stagger it.
Stagger it over the.
Okay, I just talked to my co-chair here. We're going to take a brief 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back and summarize where we are. So, 5-minute break, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Okay, we are re-adjourned, and Mr. Albrecht, ladies and gentlemen, we're reconvening. Thank you. Yeah, we're not adjourned yet.
We're re-adjourning.
We're re-adjourned. That'll be later. Mr. Albrecht has a motion.
Co-chair, thank you. So let me thank everybody. I'm going to try to recap what I think I've heard, and in 30 seconds or less, but also try to get us to some level of reaching to the middle to a shared objective. I think something I've heard loud and clear, we all acknowledge deferring the borrowing of money for new Dean beyond 2020 and the escalation costs and the one-time costs associated with sustaining the existing facility is just something we all can't live with. So how do we get to success borrowing the money in 2020? So I'm going to follow on some things out of a couple of different scenarios that were raised with a couple of new pieces. And my motion is basically for this to go to staff to figure the details out because I didn't have a calculator and I ran out of fingers and toes. The premise behind it would be that staff evaluate the 3.5% increase for the next 3 years, scenario 5, with the premise that 0.5% of that goes into a designated fund balance for new Dean.
Or for debt service.
Fair enough, but for a future debt service project for new Dean, that we maintain debt service, the schools maintain debt service at the 2018 level, so that delta beyond what ongoing debt service is this year back to what it was, that 1.6 some million dollars, again, is transferred into, is factored into not an operating, but factored into a reserve CIP account for future debt service new Dean. The city will make a new TBD contribution, which you were talking about, Mr. Elston, into that future bank account for new Dean. Don't know what that is, what it could be.
We're going to define that delta anyway.
That's right. Staff needs to work and figure that out. And the schools will contribute a one-time contribution based upon its current CIP of $1 million into that designated fund balance for new Dean. And finally, that the borrowing would have commenced in 2020 to facilitate the current plan for beneficial use of the building.
To avoid
and to avoid the $4 million we talked about, plus the $2 million in trailers, plus.
Plus the $15 million.
Do you mean borrowing or funding in 2020?
I hope he means borrowing.
Well, I believe it's borrowing because we have to, I think we have to have gone to market and borrowed the money so we can begin construction. But again, I leave it to the
Staff would
staff
recommend
and the experts to say what the right word is.
There's got to be a commitment on how that works.
My apologies, because you're going to send it to staff and they're going to work it.
Yeah. Second,
Okay.
So I open it up for discussion for what folks think.
Thank you for that discussion. I think that's great. I think it's a good summary of where this very good conversation took us. I'd like to add the caveat that we do look at a safety mechanism, and I think it can be as simple as a maintenance of past year funding, given X catastrophic downturn, and an agreement to reconvene the bodies to deal with that. So I think something like that should be added to the agreement. And I think we're in a good, from my perspective, we're now on a better track to really look at these numbers, to try to see what we can save and get to a place. So thank you.
do you think staff can do this by we have 2 meetings scheduled, one on August the 13th and one on August the 20th. I think the desire here is that this...
I didn't schedule any of them.
Right,
I
but
was
we
just
reserve
asking
those
you to
2
hold
days.
them, so-
I think the desire is that we would have all the information we're looking for in terms of the tax rate, the Davenport analysis, whatever, to get us to a point where we can hopefully move forward. Mr. Pate, do you have a feeling on the August 13th or August 20th date for staff? You want till the 20th? We're asking you honestly.
I know superintendent would like to, the later is better, but I will say that my finance
The
director will not be here on the 20th.
Staff will not be here on the 20th.
This particular staff.
But I think we're probably better to still try to push towards that date. That's, give us 3 weeks to work through it.
Given the safety valve conversation, the 20th is probably what's necessary. I don't know what that looks like. The staff may have some thoughts.
It may be as simple as, this agreement can be amended at any time by either body for different reasons, but they can certainly look at that, what a safety valve would be.
Right. I think we can come back with some parameters. I think we understand the gist of what you want to do.
Okay. Ms. Madden, can you have
I
more
have a
discussion?
question.
Okay.
So, because Mr. Elson mentioned the safety valve, and we'll look at that, would you want to include that wording in your motion?
I'm amenable to that friendly modification. Is the seconder amenable to that?
Sure. Some safety valve.
Good.
Thank you, ma'am.
That makes, that's important to me too.
That's
Thank
what
you.
Ken,
That's what Ken said.
you're seconding,
Yeah.
you're seconding what Ken said, right?
Yes.
Any other discussion? Ms. Madden, could you call the roll for the city council members, please?
Sure, would you like to do the full body or?
Just the council members, the city council.
The 3 council members.
The 3 council members of the committee.
Okay,
Bass, Elston, name.
certainly. Councilmember Avini?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Bass?
Yes.
Councilmember Elston?
Yes.
Mr. Albright?
Yes.
Mr. Demaria?
Yes.
Mrs. Keeper? Yes.
Okay.
And we're talking the 20th. We decided on that?
Let's confirm.
Are we not meeting on the 13th?
We're not meeting on the 13th, but we will meet on the 20th. And I think at that point, the expectation would be that we have this fleshed out,
We're going to agree this is someone
What
raising
time?
for $6 million.
What time?
and at 6 p.m.?
That's a few off, I don't know. what
6
time.
p.m.
6 good?
I can't make it any sooner.
Okay.
So.
6 p.m. on the 20th. Okay. Mr. Mayor, do you have any final comments, sir?
Well, first of all, thank you for everyone sitting around the table. Those that are watching as well, it's good to see. And last time I mentioned, and I think Mr. Elson even used these words, I was heartened of the conversation, good conversation tonight, working together to try to move Manassas forward. I also think about our city manager and the work that he and our staff, particularly finance staff, is going to do. And Kevin, This is a really good time to be here. Welcome. And again, thank you for the opportunity to say a word.
Anything else?
I'll go right to final comments. Mr. Williams here, just
Yeah, I've been sitting out in the hall for the last couple hours and solved all the problems. So. But seriously, I talked to the mayor earlier today, and actually this weekend as well, and I'm glad that we're progressing on a path to get to a solution. And I mentioned this a couple meetings ago, but at the forefront of our minds always be our kids, and our students, that's what we're trying to do this for, and I'm glad that we're keeping that goal in mind. So thank you all for the hard work you're doing, I appreciate it. And to the staff, thank you for doing this work, I appreciate it.
Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.